The first time I heard the name Elias Crowther, it came wrapped in a whisper, too soft to echo, too heavy to forget. People in Hollow Ridge still lower their voices when they speak of him, as though the forest might be listening, as though the trees might testify. The town sits at the edge of a wilderness that feels older than the soil itself, a place where mist drifts low and slow, bending around crooked trunks like something alive. Anyone who stays long enough learns that silence travels differently here. It carries things it shouldn't. I didn't come to Hollow Ridge searching for monsters. I came because an unsigned letter had arrived at my office, written in shaky ink and smudged fingerprints. If you want the truth, it said, look into the man who married his own grandmother. The woods will show you what the courthouse tried to bury. It sounded like folklore, another backwoods rumor meant to scare children, but something about the way the words bled into the page made it feel less like a warning and more like a plea. The townspeople pretended not to know the name, but their eyes told a different story. They watched me too closely, spoke too carefully, stepped away whenever I mentioned the Crowther cabin. One woman gripping a grocery bag so tightly her knuckles whitened whispered, "Some families hide secrets to protect themselves, others hide them to protect everyone else." By the second night, I began to understand what she meant. The air grew colder the deeper I walked into the woods behind my rented room, each step sinking into soil that felt strangely soft, like something freshly turned. And when the wind shifted, I could swear I heard it, faint, broken, almost desperate. A man's voice, pleading with someone he should never have loved. Someone who should never have loved him back. I didn't know then that I had already crossed the boundary Hollow Ridge never wanted a stranger to cross. That the truth lurking in those trees wasn't just disturbing, it was alive, restless, and waiting for someone curious enough to follow its trail. Key point number 1 expanded into ***, roughly 450 words ***, with ***, no subheadings ***, and ***, no ending sentence ***, as requested. The journalist arrived in Hollow Ridge on a grey afternoon when the sky seemed too heavy for its own color, the kind of day that presses down on the shoulders and makes every breath feel borrowed. He had driven for hours through winding mountain roads, each turn carrying him deeper into a region that seemed forgotten by both time and mapmakers. His assignment had not been sanctioned by his editor. In fact, he hadn't even mentioned it. The letter that summoned him felt too personal, too urgent, to be shared with anyone else. The paper was creased, stained at its corners, and written in a trembling hand that suggested either age or fear, maybe both. It offered no explanation, only a warning disguised as an invitation. Find the truth behind the man who married his grandmother, uncover the story the courthouse tried to erase, and come alone. As he passed through the wooden sign that marked the town limits, he felt a strange tightening in his chest. Hollow Ridge didn't look hostile, just unreachable, like a place that existed out of obligation rather than desire. The houses were old and slouched, leaning slightly as though pushed by years of unspoken weight. Porches sagged, wind chimes hung motionless despite the breeze, and faces lingered behind curtains longer than politeness allowed. He could feel their eyes on his unfamiliar car, assessing him the way one might inspect a stray animal wandering too close to the property line. The letter sat on the passenger seat, its presence almost accusatory. He found himself glancing at it every few minutes, as though it might change or disappear. It hadn't included a name for the sender, only a single line of instruction, *start at the cabin. Ask about Elias Crowther. Do not trust what they tell you first. The lack of clarity might have deterred someone else, but mystery had always been the journalist's oxygen. Still, he couldn't shake the sensation that Hollow Ridge was not merely a setting for the story but an active participant, a place with its own pulse, its own intentions. He checked into the only motel in town, a narrow, two-story building that looked as if it had been assembled from leftover parts of abandoned barns. The receptionist barely spoke, sliding the key across the counter without meeting his eyes. When he asked for directions to the old Crowther property, she hesitated just long enough for him to notice before muttering a vague route that looped through the woods. He stepped outside again, inhaling the cold, damp air, realizing Hollow Ridge was already shifting around him like a creature adjusting to an intruder. Here is ***, key point number 2 expanded into 450 words ***, with asterisk asterisk no subheadings asterisk asterisk and asterisk asterisk no ending sentence asterisk asterisk, exactly as requested. The first thing the journalist noticed as he moved through Hollow Ridge was how quickly conversations died when he came near. People didn't simply avoid talking about the past, they avoided talking altogether. Every time he approached someone with a polite greeting or a harmless question about the area, he felt an invisible door close in the space between them. It wasn't the kind of silence born from rudeness or small-town suspicion but something heavier, as if words themselves were dangerous here. The locals carried an unease that clung to their expressions, and whenever he mentioned the woods, he saw their faces tighten the way a body braces for impact. It became clear that the forest surrounding Hollow Ridge was not just a landscape but a boundary, a living barrier that the townspeople treated with a cautious reverence. At the diner on his first morning, he tried again. The waitress, a woman in her late 50s with tired eyes and hands that shook ever so slightly, poured his coffee without looking at him. He asked a simple question, one that should have been met with a shrug or a harmless answer. "Do you know anything about the Crowther family?" Her hand froze mid-air, the coffee pot hovering above the table like something caught between past and present. She set it down quietly, leaned in as if someone might be listening, and whispered, "You shouldn't go digging into things this town has already buried." Before he could respond, she straightened her posture and walked away, refusing to return to his table for the rest of his meal. Outside, the air felt colder than it had the day before. A group of older men sitting on a bench outside the general store stopped talking altogether when he approached. They didn't look at him directly, but he could sense their eyes flicking to him in brief, guarded glances. When he attempted to ask about the courthouse files mentioned in the letter, one of the men muttered, "Some stories stay in the ground because the cost of digging them up is too high," and the others nodded without saying a word. It was as if the entire town operated under a silent agreement that certain truths were forbidden, not because they were shameful but because they were dangerous. Even the children playing near the edge of the woods behaved strangely. They chased one another joyfully until they noticed him watching, at which point they froze in place. One girl, no older than 8, pointed toward the tree line and said in a soft, matter-of-fact voice, "The woods remember everything." Her friends pulled her away immediately, scolding her under their breath as though she had violated a rule. The journalist realized then that Hollow Ridge was not simply reluctant to speak, it was afraid to. Here is asterisk asterisk key point number 3 expanded into 450 words asterisk asterisk, written without subheadings or an ending sentence. By the time the journalist had spent a full day wandering the town, he began to understand that most of the residents would rather die than mention the Crowther family. Every casual question about the boy who had married his grandmother was met with either silence or hurried deflection. Yet, in the dim light of a late afternoon, he found a doorway to the truth in the form of Mrs. Abernathy, an elderly woman whose hands were gnarled like the roots of the trees surrounding Hollow Ridge. She lived at the very edge of town, where the last crooked houses gave way to dense forest, and she had been watching the journalist with wary curiosity since he arrived. When he knocked on her door, the hinges groaned in protest, announcing his presence with a weight that made him hesitate. Mrs. Abernathy opened the door just enough to let a sliver of her face through. Her eyes, clouded yet piercing, seemed to measure him against some invisible scale. After a long pause, she stepped aside and allowed him in, muttering something about nobody should be poking at old ghosts. Inside, the house smelled of mothballs, damp wood, and the faintest trace of decayed leaves. It was as though the forest had crept in through the cracks in the walls and claimed the space as its own. Over a cup of weak tea, the journalist tried to ease her into conversation, speaking gently, carefully, aware that one wrong word could shut her down completely. She listened, nodding slightly, then exhaled a breath that carried both resignation and warning. Slowly, in a voice brittle as dry leaves, she began to recount what she had known all her life. The boy had grown up almost entirely isolated, left to the care of a grandmother who was both loving and terrifying, a woman whose devotion bordered on obsession. He didn't see other children, she said, her eyes drifting toward the curtained window as if to avoid the memories themselves. He barely left the cabin. The world was only what she allowed him to see. She described a childhood marked by a strange rhythm of control and secrecy. The grandmother taught him manners, religion, and the stories of the family, but she also instilled fear of outsiders, of townspeople, of anyone who might disrupt the life she had carved for them. She insisted that he trust no one but her, that the woods were safe only under her watchful eyes. Over time, that isolation became a cage, and yet, in the twisted logic of her love, it was a shield. Mrs. Abernathy hesitated, then added, almost as if speaking to herself, "Some things aren't just hidden, they're protected, and not always for the right reasons." The journalist scribbled notes furiously, realizing he had stumbled into a story far more complicated than he could have imagined. The boy's upbringing, sheltered and distorted by his grandmother, had created a life that no ordinary investigation could untangle easily, and he sensed the weight of generations pressing down on the fragile truths he was only beginning to uncover. Here is *** key point number 4 expanded into 450 words ***, with ***, no subheadings ***, and ***, no ending sentence ***. The journalist found the Crowther cabin tucked deep in the forest, half swallowed by vines and shadow, its wooden walls sagging as though burdened by decades of secrecy. The path leading up to it was narrow and overgrown, lined with moss-covered stones and fallen branches that snapped underfoot, sending echoes into the quiet woods. The air around the house felt heavier, saturated with the scent of damp earth and rotting timber, and he realized immediately that the place had not been touched in years. The windows were dark, reflecting the trees outside like mirrors, hiding whatever lay within from casual observation. The closer he approached, the more he felt a pressure in his chest, a tension that suggested the cabin itself was aware of his presence. Inside, dust motes floated in shafts of weak sunlight that filtered through cracked panes. The walls were lined with faded wallpaper, peeling like curling skin, and furniture stood at odd angles as if moved in haste long ago. It was a scene frozen in time, but what drew his attention most was the discovery of a hidden room behind a false panel in the corner of the main hall. The door was small, crude, almost childlike, and it resisted his first attempts to push it open. Once it yielded, a musty odor of decay and disuse hit him, stronger than the rest of the cabin. The room was narrow, claustrophobic, and entirely lined with photographs that stretched from floor to ceiling. Each image was more disturbing than the last. They depicted a boy growing older over the years, yet in every photograph, the grandmother was always present, always in the background, her eyes sharp and unnervingly alert. In some, she appeared to be smiling, but the smile never reached her eyes. In others, she hovered just behind him, hands resting lightly on his shoulders, almost as if guiding him through the stages of his life like a puppeteer. Some photographs showed moments that should have been private, him waking, eating, even moments of vulnerability, but she was always there, watching, documenting, controlling. It was a visual diary of a life lived entirely under her gaze. The more he examined the images, the more he noticed something odd. The grandmother seemed not to age at all. Her face remained the same, wrinkleless and sharp, while the boy changed, becoming taller, broader, older. There was an unnatural permanence about her, a sense that she had been frozen in time for decades while everything else moved forward. Shadows in the corners of the room seemed to shift as he looked, and for a moment, he imagined her standing behind him, invisible but aware. He could almost hear her whispering, commanding, reminding him of a family secret that had never been meant for outsiders. Each photograph was a window into a twisted devotion, a life under surveillance, and he understood with a sudden, chilling clarity that the story of the Crowther boy was not just disturbing, it was meticulously preserved, a secret that had been hiding in plain sight. Here is *** key point number 5 expanded into 450 words ***, with ***, no subheadings ***, and ***, no ending sentence ***. The journalist's investigation took a darker turn when he finally met Mr. Grayson, the town's oldest resident, a man whose age had carved deep canyons into his face and whose hands trembled even when resting in his lap. Most townsfolk avoided him, claiming he spoke too freely, that his memories were dangerous and sometimes too vivid to trust. But the journalist had tracked him down, hoping for a first-hand account of the Crowther family, and the old man's eyes, sharp and calculating beneath heavy lids, hinted that he knew far more than anyone else dared to admit. He spoke slowly, dragging out each word as though pulling it from the depths of a long-buried nightmare, and the journalist realized that every story he was about to tell had been carried alone for decades. He began with small details at first, questions that might have been about anything. Then, almost reluctantly, Mr. Grayson shifted his gaze toward the cabin in the woods and exhaled a breath that carried more fear than the journalist had expected. He described the night he had witnessed Elias Crowther and his grandmother leaving the forest together, a night when the moon hung low and sickly in the sky. He remembered it not because of the weather or the ordinary movements of two people walking, but because of the way their clothes had been stained, dark and glistening, as if soaked in blood. The memory made the old man's hands quiver, his voice dropped to a whisper, and he glanced around nervously as though the forest itself might have been listening. The journalist pressed him for more details, careful not to push too hard, but Mr. Grayson's recollection grew sharper, more precise, as if the years had done nothing to diminish its clarity. He described the grandmother's posture, unnaturally upright and commanding, her gaze fixed on the boy as he followed her without hesitation, almost as though his will had been stripped away. Shadows in the trees seemed to bend and twist around them, he said, and the night air carried an unnatural chill that had lingered long after they had vanished from sight. The old man could not explain what had happened after they returned to the cabin, only that the next morning, the boy appeared changed, distant, silent, as though some invisible boundary had been crossed. What struck the journalist most was not the horror of the act itself, but the matter-of-factness with which Mr. Grayson recalled it, as though he had been carrying the knowledge of something grotesquely ordinary for decades. There was no embellishment, no flair for the dramatic, just raw, unrelenting truth hidden beneath layers of fear and habit. The man's eyes, though clouded with age, burned with a warning, and as he leaned forward, gripping the edge of his chair so tightly that his knuckles whitened, the journalist understood that this story, the story of the boy and his grandmother, had been witnessed by someone who could never unsee it. Here is ***key point number 6 expanded into 450 words ***, with ***, no subheadings ***, and ***, no ending sentence ***. The sealed courthouse file was nothing like the journalist expected. It sat in a dusty corner of the county archives, hidden behind stacks of ordinary legal documents that seemed far less interesting than the whispers surrounding the Crowther family. The clerk who handed it over did so with visible reluctance, her eyes darting toward the door as if someone or something might be watching. The file itself was thick and bound with brittle tape, its cover faded and smudged, the label nearly illegible. A simple title had been typed on the front, **Crowther, Marriage Records Star. There were no dates, no names other than Elias Crowther and a name that matched the grandmother's identity on legal forms, and yet every page radiated a tension that seemed almost palpable, as though the paper itself remembered the secrets it held. Inside, the documents were meticulous, legalistic, and yet curiously incomplete. Marriage certificates had been filled out in precise handwriting, stamped and signed, but entire sections were blacked out, erased, or torn away. Photocopies of witness statements had been carefully altered, leaving only the vaguest fragments of conversation. The most disturbing element was the sense of deliberate erasure. The courthouse had not just recorded a union that defied social and legal norms, it had actively tried to erase it from history. The journalist could trace faint pencil marks where dates had been changed, where signatures had been reworked, where entire paragraphs had been scrubbed of meaning. It was a record designed to exist yet pretend it never had, a bureaucratic limbo for a story too grotesque for public acknowledgement. Among the papers, the journalist found a note, handwritten in a script that seemed hurried and fearful: "Do not let this see the light. If anyone learns, it cannot be undone." It wasn't signed, and yet the handwriting suggested urgency, almost panic. Legal codes, sworn statements, and affidavits existed in a strange juxtaposition with the note, the cold precision of law entwined with the tremor of human fear. Every page reinforced the same message: this was a marriage that should not exist, and the world had been instructed to forget it. As he worked through the file, he realized that the documents suggested more than an illegal union. They hinted at a community complicit in silence, a system that had recognized the marriage but actively removed it from view. There were subtle notations, small annotations in the margins, indicating that the case had been reviewed repeatedly, debated quietly, and ultimately suppressed. Some entries were scratched out entirely, leaving only faint impressions of words and numbers, almost like a fingerprint pressed into the paper decades ago. For the journalist, each torn page and blurred line became a breadcrumb leading deeper into a labyrinth of secrecy, where law, family, and fear collided in a pattern that no ordinary investigation could fully explain. Here is *** key point number 7 expanded into 450 words ***, written without subheadings or an ending sentence. It began subtly at first, a sense of unease that the journalist couldn't shake no matter how many times he told himself it was simply nerves. The motel he had checked into was small, tucked on the edge of Hollowridge's main road, with creaking floorboards and a long, narrow hallway that smelled faintly of mildew. At night, the wind pushed through cracks in the window panes, creating noises that could have been dismissed as ordinary. But when he stepped outside to look at the moonlit forest, he noticed footprints pressed into the soft soil near the edge of the tree line, bare and oddly twisted. They were not human in the conventional sense. The toes were irregular, elongated, and curved, leaving marks that twisted unnaturally as they led toward the shadows between the trees. He crouched to examine them more closely, feeling a chill crawl along his spine. The footprints stopped abruptly at the edge of the motel's gravel path, then continued again farther down the road, weaving and doubling back with no clear direction. There were no accompanying sounds, no crunch of leaves, no snapping of twigs, just the impression of movement, deliberate and silent. The journalist took out his notebook and sketched the unusual shapes, noting the size, the angle, the way the foot seemed to twist unnaturally at the ankle. Every instinct told him he should retreat, that the tracks were a warning, and yet curiosity kept him crouched on the ground, tracing them with his eyes into the darkness. By the second night, the footprints appeared again, this time leading directly to his own door. He woke to the sound of faint scratching against the wooden frame, subtle enough that he could have mistaken it for the wind, but the pattern was too irregular, too intentional. The scratches stopped whenever he turned on the light and resumed the moment he let it go out. He found himself standing by the window, peering into the forest, heart pounding, straining to see shapes moving between the trees. Shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally, and the forest silence felt deliberate, expectant, as if it was watching him back. He began to notice more anomalies around the motel. Items shifted slightly overnight, personal effects moved a few inches from where he left them. Doors he was certain he had locked were left ajar in the morning. On one occasion, he found a single twisted footprint on the floor inside his room, soft in the dust, leading toward the hidden corner of the cabin across the road. The impression was unmistakable, irregular like the ones outside, too large and bent to belong to any ordinary human, and it ended as suddenly as it began, leaving him staring at the floor with a rising sense of dread, realizing that someone or something was marking a presence that refused to be ignored. Here is ** key point number 8 expanded into 450 words ***, with ***, no subheadings ***, and ***, no ending sentence ***. The discovery of the forgotten journal felt like stumbling into a secret the forest itself had been hiding. The journalist had found it tucked behind the false panel in the Crowther cabin, among the same photographs and old keepsakes that had already unnerved him. The cover was leather, cracked and dry, the pages yellowed and brittle at the edges, but the handwriting inside was unmistakably careful, deliberate, and yet at times frantic. It belonged to Elias Crowther, the boy raised in isolation, and reading it was like listening to someone speaking across decades, whispering truths too dangerous to share aloud. Each entry carried a mixture of obedience and terror, a reflection of a mind formed under the constant surveillance of a grandmother whose influence had never waned. The earliest entries were deceptively mundane. He wrote about chores, the woods, the weather, and the rhythm of life within the cabin. Yet beneath the surface, there were hints of something darker, fleeting references to voices in the trees and shadows that moved even when no one was there. As the pages progressed, the tone shifted. The boy began to speak of his grandmother in a way that suggested a growing unease, a fear that she was not merely a caregiver but a presence that could manipulate the world itself. He described moments where she would vanish for hours, returning with stories of distant places and strange people that no one else seemed to know existed, as though she were part of a reality entirely separate from his own. By the middle of the journal, the entries became almost obsessive. The boy wrote about noticing changes in her face, the way her expressions sometimes flickered like something trying to conceal a secret. "Her eyes aren't hers," he wrote one night, "sometimes they're mine, sometimes someone else's. She watches me, always, but not as herself. She has other faces, other people inside her, and I am the only one who knows. The sentence was jagged, the handwriting spiking and plunging across the page in a way that suggested the writing itself was an act of both control and desperation. Later entries described incidents he had never mentioned to anyone else: noises in the cabin at odd hours, doors opening by themselves, objects moving. He questioned his own sanity but also hinted at a deeper terror, an understanding that the grandmother's power over him extended beyond love, beyond fear. It was something unnatural, something that could reshape reality itself when no one else was watching. He wrote with the precision of someone trying to capture a world slipping from his grasp, cataloguing each strange occurrence, each fleeting sense of being observed, as though documenting it could somehow protect him. The journal revealed a mind trapped between devotion and horror, a consciousness shaped entirely by a grandmother who was not fully human in the way he had once believed. Here is *** key point number 9 expanded into 450 words ***, written without subheadings and without an ending sentence. Tracking down the now elderly Elias Crowther proved far more difficult than the journalist had imagined. Rumors said he had vanished from Hollow Ridge years ago, retreating even further into isolation, and the few who remembered him spoke in hushed tones, as if simply mentioning his name could summon trouble. After days of searching and following half-remembered directions from wary locals, the journalist finally found him living in a small cabin on the edge of the forest, its walls cloaked in ivy and shadow. Elias was a man bent with age, his hair thin and grey, his skin lined with decades of sun and worry, yet his eyes still held the sharp, unsettling intelligence that had defined him in youth. There was something strange in the way he moved, careful and deliberate, as though the forest itself had trained him to step silently, to measure every action before it was taken. When the journalist introduced himself and explained the purpose of his visit, Elias studied him for a long time, his expression unreadable. Finally, he spoke in a low, measured voice, hesitant yet filled with the authority of experience. He did not deny the rumors, nor did he confirm them immediately. Instead, he began to recount the story of his life under the grandmother's influence, speaking not with the shame or guilt that the journalist expected, but with a strange mixture of awe and terror. "I believed I married my grandmother," he said at one point, almost matter-of-factly, "but that was not the whole truth. The woman I thought was her, she was wearing her skin. She wore it like a costume, like a mask to hide what she truly was." The revelation struck the journalist with a physical force, a momentary paralysis of disbelief. Elias described the early days of his union, the confusion and disorientation, the way the woman shifted subtly before his eyes, her mannerisms not entirely matching the grandmother he had known. He spoke of nights when he awoke to feel her presence in the room, her eyes glowing faintly in the dark, the air thick with an unnatural stillness, and he realized that nothing about his upbringing had been ordinary. The grandmother had been a vessel for something older, something inhuman, and the life he had lived under her care had been manipulated and observed for purposes he could not fully understand. Elias's voice wavered as he recalled certain memories, moments of intimacy and trust twisted by the knowledge that he had been interacting with something not human. The realization that the woman who had shaped his childhood, who had commanded his obedience and devotion, was not truly the person he had known, left him in a state of permanent unease. Every interaction, every memory, carried the weight of deception and horror, and even decades later, he remained haunted by the certainty that he had been bound to a presence that wore the face of someone he loved. Here is *** key point number 10 expanded into 450 words ***, written without subheadings and without an ending sentence. The journalist had prepared himself for a routine exhumation, expecting a simple confirmation of death and the retrieval of remains for evidence. The small cemetery behind Hollow Ridge was nearly overgrown, with crooked tombstones tilting in the damp soil, moss covering names until they were barely legible. He had been warned by the town's residents that disturbing the grave would be unwise, that some things were meant to remain buried, but the curiosity that had carried him this far would not allow him to turn back. As the team began their work, the air was thick with anticipation, the sky overcast, casting a grey pallor that made the earth itself seem reluctant to release its secret. When the coffin was finally opened, the sight that greeted him was unlike anything he could have imagined. The wood was splintered, gouged with marks that suggested a desperate struggle, as though the body had tried to escape the confines of its burial. But the most disturbing detail was the absence of remains. The coffin was almost entirely empty, filled with dirt that had been disturbed in a manner too chaotic to be natural. There were claw marks along the interior walls, deep and uneven, as if something with strength and intelligence had fought to break free. The journalist felt a chill crawl up his spine as he knelt to examine the contents more closely, noting that the soil was compacted in places, loose in others, and littered with fragments that suggested a presence far stranger than he could yet comprehend. The silence of the cemetery was oppressive, broken only by the soft creak of tools and the whisper of wind through the trees. The workers, seasoned and unshakable in most situations, were visibly uneasy, casting glances at one another as if to confirm they were not imagining what they saw. The journalist realized that the absence of a body was itself a statement, a defiance of logic and expectation, and he felt the weight of generations pressing down upon him. It was as though the grandmother, or whatever had worn her face, had anticipated this moment, had left a final message embedded in the soil to unsettle anyone who dared seek the truth. Fragments of cloth and bits of jewelry lay scattered among the earth, hints of identity without substance, remnants that suggested presence without confirmation. The claw marks seemed almost intentional, leading in patterns that hinted at motion, direction, and perhaps intelligence. The journalist's mind raced, piecing together the impossible narrative: a life carefully observed, a body that vanished from the very grave meant to hold it, and a presence that had endured beyond death, beyond human understanding. As he stepped back to view the coffin in its entirety, a creeping awareness settled over him. This was not merely a family secret hidden in the woods, it was a mystery that had taken form, that had survived in the dark soil, and that refused to be contained by stone or time.